Hi everyone, this week we're talking about climate change and how it acts as a challenge to some of the existing paradigms we've discussed relating to the global business environment. So I'll be going through a couple of different issues in this lecture with you. So in this lecture I'll be going through three main areas, looking at what climate change is, how it challenges our model that we've been discussing of the global business environment, and then finally I'll be looking at some examples of opportunities and some more positive things that may arise from this topic area. I think before we go any more deeper into what climate change is, it's worthwhile thinking a little bit about how environmentalism has come about to start off with. There's a general understanding that there were some negative externalities caused by industrial activity. And this is really sort of seen in early literature and early writing during the Industrial Revolution, people understanding that actually there were situations where people's livelihoods, people's standard of living were impacted negatively as a result of increasing urbanization and increasing industrialization. The first book in kind of the post-war era that I would refer to in terms of being leading with the environmental movement would be Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And she really updated some of the principles of living in harmony with the earth and environmentalism and being positive towards environmental interaction. She updated that with a view of what might happen if we don't pay attention to our environment. We keep pumping out toxic chemicals into rivers, and we may at some point have a silent spring whereby there are no birds left to sing because all the insects have been killed and all the birds as a result die out as well. And I think that's quite a powerful book from the 1970s, which is really worthwhile reading if you get a chance. From the 1970s to the 80s, there was a kind of general perception that urban pollution was very negative. And I've talked previously in another week about acid rain being a negative externality. That's again a 1980s and 70s kind of heavy industry externality. I think there's also a long-standing perception that there are health and safety concerns as a result of heavy industry. For instance, the scandals around asbestosis in the UK are a great example. Perhaps as well Teflon in America as well, with the DuPont kind of poisoning different water sources there as well. I think finally then, what's worth mentioning is this big push in the 1980s as a result of nuclear contamination from Chernobyl and the disaster in Chernobyl. There was also kind of a long-standing kind of leaks in 3 Mile Island and Sellafield as well. And both of those situations led to a general perception that maybe we need to think more carefully about some of the things that we're doing with our economy and how it interacts, therefore, with our environment. Okay, so for our purposes, climate change is an all-encompassing term that covers the shift in global climate, how it's changed as a result of human activity. And usually this is measured against a baseline of 1900. i.e. that temperatures have changed since 1900 and we've had mass industrialization throughout the 20th century, and now by 2024 we're seeing an increase in global temperatures as a result of human activity. Annual reports are produced about this, and those reports in terms of are usually looking at the amount of carbon in the atmosphere as being the major indicator of what is causing climate change. And that's then compared back to historical records from things like ice cores or tree records to understand how our climate has changed and how it compares to historical records as well in the past. There is overwhelming scientific support that industrialization is the cause for this. If anybody tries to tell you that it's a debatable issue, it really isn't in terms of scientific evidence. There is no scientific evidence that contradicts this hypothesis that man is causing this change in the environment. So much of the rationale behind this is due to oil and fossil fuel extraction and usage. From the point where we started to use fossil fuels heavily for steam in cars, we've seen these non-renewable resources utilised for economic growth purposes. Most of our cities are designed around getting around them using some kind of motor vehicle or motorised transportation. most of our lives are designed around that as well. An entire civilization is designed around extractive fossil fuel usage. This, of course, means that countries with fossil fuels have gained a lot of economic and political dominance globally. It's easy, therefore, to point to, for instance, OPEC, the oil-producing countries, as having a great deal of power. The USA, Russia, obviously a lot of power, and for instance, look at smaller countries like Venezuela using their fossil fuel resources for economic growth. And obviously, this is a double-edged sword because it creates growth, but equally, it has a negative downside as well. So this is a chart of the number of coal-fired power stations by country in 2024. The UK now has no more coal-fired power stations. It's interesting to see that mainland China now has 1,161 coal power stations pumping out emissions, burning fossil fuels every single day. India is second place with 285, the United States at 204, all significant sources of really negative emissions. I also find it interesting to see that Germany still has 48 coal-fired power stations, and this is partly a result of their very sort of cautious approach to nuclear energy, in particular after the Fukushima disaster, but also their wish to move away from gas reliance, which they used to get lots of gas from Russia. So the particular situation regarding Germany and Poland and so on, it's quite significant that they are still producing emissions using coal power stations in 2024. So what are some of the implications of climate change? And it may seem, it's quite easy for us to kind of gloss over this sometimes, but it's worthwhile just reiterating it. Number one is obviously increasing global temperatures lead to melting ice caps, which leads to rising sea levels. This actually endangers several countries. Several countries are at the COP29 this week, making the case that they need support to secure their future because they are very really in danger of disappearing. We also will have longer, hotter summers, equally more droughts, but equally also wildfires as well. In 2020, it's interesting to see the reports about how awful wildfires were in Australia, and that whole thing just got overshadowed by the awfulness of COVID. But of course, warmer air leads to more moisture being held in the air, which leads to heavier rain, which when you combine that with harder packed earth from droughts, means we have the flash flooding we saw recently in Spain and other issues such as that. I worked on a project in Newcastle in 2017 where we had to prepare the ground for the building site we were working on. We had to prepare it for a 1 in 100 year downpour of rain on a regular occasion. We were basically preparing the site to have a 1 in 100 event of rainfall on a regular basis. That's how much they'd sort of decided to future-proof things and were aware of the impact of climate change just in somewhere like Newcastle. Of course, we'll have a change in flora and fauna, animals and plants, because we may not have the insects in the same place. We may have insects migrating further north who were previously in the south. We may have certain insect species dying out, certain animal species struggling to survive as well. I didn't use the classic photo of a polar bear swimming in the sea between icebergs, but of course that's one of the big issues, is that we're losing a unique part of our world environment. And finally, all of these different factors contribute to potentially a reduction in global agricultural output, which may lead to an increase in famine and therefore things like an increase in global migration as people move away from areas of the world which are just not habitable anymore and seek to find new areas to live in. So I think it's really significant in terms of the wide-ranging implications of climate change. As one little example, little vignette on its own I thought was interesting was I went to the Fox Glacier in 2012, and at the time it was already receding. You could see when we were walking up to the glacier, there's several kilometres of rocks and scrub and so on. And from about 1940 onwards, it started to decline in size. It has recouped some size, very briefly in the 1990s, but the overall trend line is for Fox Glacier and glaciers globally to be declining in size. That's releasing, again, lots of water. It's destroying unique environments, and it's destroying unique opportunities for creatures, plants, and animals to live there. So it's a really, for me, it's a really sort of obvious kind of demonstration of how climate change is affecting us. So industrialisation has some very negative impacts, as well as some positive ones for growth. The negative externalities from industrialisation are apparent from the current data, which we'll look at in a second. But there are also localised issues as well, to do with local airborne pollution near factories, for instance in urban environments as well, to do with cars emitting gases as well. One of the classic examples is that in Europe, lots of people switched to using diesel vehicles because there was a perception that they'd have lower carbon emissions because they were more efficient in terms of the amount of diesel used per mile. However, we found that the particulates within diesel were actually more harmful overall to people who are near them. So, for instance, using them for buses would be more difficult, more dangerous for cyclists also inhabiting those bus lanes. Accidents and pollution events have also had a major impact on both real environments and also perception of industrial externalities. I might have mentioned previously Chernobyl, of course, and Fukushima, but we could also look at things like the Exxon Valdez oil spill and also the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico as well, both big oil spills which led to huge impacts on the local environment. I think what's important to recognise is that none of these effects respects national borders. As I mentioned in the week, we were talking about acid rain. These issues are not, they don't respect the jurisdiction who needs to clean them up, and they are affecting all of us globally. So let's look at some of the data. The total for country emissions is topped by, obviously, China in terms of 11.2 megatons of CO2 per year, followed by the US and the EU. Obviously, China is a big manufacturing base and is followed up by another big manufacturing base, the US. The EU, obviously a large area of industrial production as well, India being fourth place, followed by Russia. But this doesn't really tell us much about the source of the demand for the products that have been made by these different countries. For instance, we may see actually that even though China is making the most emissions, that the demand for the products that have been made in China are in other markets such as the EU and the US. And actually when we link back the emissions to the people who are demanding the goods that cause those emissions, then we might see a different picture. That's where the data regarding per person emissions or per capita emissions comes in on the right hand side of the screen. So per person in 2023, this levels out somewhat to the population issue and starts to let us see how much each country is producing per person that lives there. The table is, of course, therefore it's topped by some of the Gulf states such as Qatar, Brunei, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait. And we're actually looking for countries like China per person because the population is so great. We're down to around 8 tons per person. So let's look at the CO2 per capita comparing 2023 to 1990. So in 1990, the UK was producing 10.4 tons per person and the US 20 tons per person. By 2023, it's estimated that it's around 4 tons per person in the UK and 15 tons per person in the US. A significant drop for both, but obviously the UK has gone a lot further, a lot faster, and also from a lower base. The BRICS, however, are quite a different picture. Rather than reducing their emissions, they have in some instances increased them. So Brazil is one of the great examples here, where we're averaging out 2.3 tons per person for Brazilians because the amount of growth that's happened in their economy and the industrialisation has increased the amount they're producing per person. Russia has gone through a transition away from some of the heavy industries and instead towards extracting and selling raw resources. So therefore, the actual level of CO2 emitted by Russian industry has fallen slightly. India has increased. It's been a massive increase since 1990 to 2023 in terms of overall economic productivity and production. So we're seeing 2.1 tons per person in India, as opposed to 0.6 in 1990. China's been the biggest difference, though, with an exponential growth in terms of the amount produced per person from 2 to over 8 in 2023. So to try and challenge some of these problems, the Conference of the Parties was established in 1990, and it's moved forward since then. And the most pivotal one in recent memory has been Paris. In Paris in 2015, 196 countries agreed to legally binding targets to reduce their overall carbon emissions and try to make sure that the increase in global average temperature would stay below 2 degrees Celsius. That's at the point at which it starts to get really difficult for life on Earth, and significant adaptations need to be put into place to allow our civilization to continue. And actually, they went further than that and said, look, we need to make sure we don't go any further than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, because that's when we start to really sort of find some of those really big problems occurring. This is obviously to do with excessive droughts, heat waves, and excessive rainfall. But what motivated lots of the parties at this point was the understanding that there would be a significant economic issue if they went above 1.5 degrees Celsius. COP24 is happening right now, and it'd be really interesting if you got a chance to have a look at that. I'll put the website link on the module page for you. I've also downloaded most recent IPCC reports as well for you to have a look at. Every single country, again, is at COP29, but not every country has sent their key players in the way they did it to Paris. Paris had people like Angela Merkel and Barack Obama there pushing for positive climate action, whereas at COP29 it's very much the delegations from different countries. And we've seen, for instance, the US have sent a delegation from the Biden administration who are obviously on their way out in a couple of months' time. There's also lots of suggestion that this COP is being used rather than for technical purposes for looking at funding streams for different countries, for different projects. Instead, it's been used for oil lobbying by I think it's 1,700 different gas and oil companies who are actually at the conference as well. Finally then, the conference was opened by one of the conveners who stated that he felt that oil and coal were gifts from God. Not necessarily that we therefore need to be careful with them and eke them out, but actually that they were a gift in terms of economic growth and an opportunity for humans to use them, which is a very troubling thing for a leader of a major climate change conference to say. There is, however, hope that there will still be an agreement from this COP and a statement from the COP which actually allows for some kind of more positive action to be made. There's also hope that the next one will be more positive in terms of definite agenda setting. I can't really ignore the fact that Mr. Trump is coming back to the White House, and it's going to be quite difficult for climate change and for climate change agendas to weather his new tenure in office. He's one of the people who globally has had a very complicated approach to climate change, and his perception has perhaps changed over time. Some of this, I think, is really due to the nature of economic reliance upon fossil fuels in the US. You know, his beliefs about climate change and his beliefs around petrochemicals really are linked with the American economy and the American psyche. They're very much designed themselves around the use of these fuels. However, he's not alone. Other international leaders such as Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Putin and Morrison as well, they've all actually made some quite difficult proclamations regarding fossil fuels and regarding climate change. I think this is particularly opposite when you put it into the context of where these countries are, what these countries produce. For instance, Australia is a massive kind of extractive country. It has lots and lots of coal mines, lots of natural resources which it is using. So therefore, there's an invested interest in making kind of retaining some of the benefits of those economic activity. Let's look back a few years. 2009, Donald Trump was one of the signatories for a New York Times advert which was really pushing for Barack Obama to actually make progress at the Copenhagen conference of the parties, and that was it's interesting to see his name back on there, and as alongside other people who have since made rather kind of sharp comments regarding climate change as well. So 2009, Donald Trump appeared to be very, very positive towards environmental protectionism and very, believed in climate change, whereas his positions changed rather a lot. During the 2016 to 2020 presidency, he withdrew America from the Conference of the Parties Paris Agreement targets. He said actually that the Paris Climate Agreement was flawed and it would actually hurt American industries. He's called climate change a hoax created by the Chinese. But then the flip side is he's come back and said, I want to plant lots of trees. I want to, I'm an environmentalist. I want to support these different industries that will lead us to a new future. But then in the last few months, we've seen him on the campaign trail openly stating that he wants to reopen Alaskan pipelines. He wants to tap into the liquid gold beneath our feet, and he wants to drill baby drill, which are all very much odds with this idea about trying to protect us from an over 1.5 Celsius increase in climate. Just to kind of capture some of the points we're making so far, I wanted to kind of use this slide. I think it really neatly captures some of the initial drivers and changes to the climate system that are actually being incurred. So things like warmer land and air, warming oceans, rising sea levels, ocean acidification as there's a lowering of oxygen levels in the ocean. All these things lead to external impacts. But we can see these external impacts are not just separate to the core function, the core mechanism that's causing them as well. They're all interrelated as well. So as soon as we start to adjust one area of our environment, we see these externalities tripping off over each other and actually accelerating a lot of the time and causing more and more damage. They're all associated with each other in some way. And overall, I think it's worthwhile, I think many people are now viewing this in this way. If we're looking at this from an economics perspective, it's worthwhile thinking about this as being a cost to running businesses, and a cost of business, and a cost of our business models, which is undermining our overall efficacy and overall growth. Okay, now I'm going to start looking at a few more of the positive elements, because there are some positive opportunities resulting from activism and movement on climate change adaptation. And that might sound a bit perverse, but what I mean by that is that countries are making inroads to this issue. There are areas for economic growth here as well. For example, here I've got on the screen a graphic which shows that between quarter two, i.e. sort of springtime 2023, and quarter two 2024, the UK's total generation of electricity increased by 10% from renewables. So we shifted by 10% to renewables in a year. And that's been an ongoing increasing trend for the UK. We're actually looking at moving as much of our energy production to renewable sources as possible. The biggest source of this is bioenergy, which is unfortunately burning renewable sources of wood and grain and so on. So that's more controversial. But there's been a big increase in offshore wind as well. And I think offshore wind and onshore wind will be the two areas that I think the Labour government have already indicated they want to start investing in. So were I in the industry of energy production, I'd be thinking, okay, what grants are available? How do I tap into this new market that's burgeoning in the UK? Another opportunity is really about the fact that there is broad public concern about climate change and recognition that it is an issue. So even though countries, political leaders may not be willing to take the hit on their personal reputation, broader public, think they should do and actually support more climate action. In the EU, something like 47% of people think that climate change is a major threat to society, whereas in China it's up to 73%. So even though the Chinese are producing the most climate change gases, they are recognised as a public that it's a significant problem. I think the graph on belief in climate change is quite interesting here. That's a YouGov poll done in the UK, which shows that around a stable 70% of people in the UK believe in climate change and believe there's a significant issue as well. There's only a very small rump number of 5% who do not believe in climate change in the UK. And I think that's why some of the idea that perhaps as a major stakeholder, the public are actually ahead of political opinion and political action in many ways. So we accept that there is some impetus behind making a change towards more climate-friendly business models, and therefore we need to think about what those adaptations might look like. Now, natural systems, obviously, if we are doing something that is natural or there is a natural system, it will obviously react to what's happening. Natural systems cannot anticipate changes to climate. They just respond to what's happening around them. So we see, for instance, wetlands changing. We see ecosystems are changing over time as well. We see maybe animals migrating in different times of the year. For humans, we can actually look at how we can anticipate some of those changes. We can perhaps change the architecture of buildings in an anticipatory fashion, or we can move somewhere else to when it becomes unfeasible for us to live somewhere. In terms of public sphere, we can look at sort of adopting early warning systems to make us sure we anticipate potential changes, or we could look at, for instance, offering compensation or subsidies for those areas which are affected by climate change. In terms of adaptation principles then, how would we sort of look at a base principle for a business? Well, obviously you guys might have heard of the idea of reusing, recycling and reducing our impact and the use of things. I think it's worthwhile including repurposing as well, looking for options for supplies and for goods and services which we can use in different ways to actually repurpose them for other purposes in our businesses or in our homes. The key here is to try and optimize the return on the factors of production, and that fits really well with very solid economic principles of efficiency. We're trying to make sure that we get the most from the inputs we have, rather than relying upon the fact that fossil fuels are cheap. We therefore have that kind of bolster within the system. We need to assume now instead that actually the factors of production are rather more expensive, if not in terms of money, but in terms of the impact they have and the externalities they have. This also needs us obviously to take stakeholders with us. Now we know that the stakeholders are happy to look at these options. They believe in climate change. So therefore we need to think about how we respect their opportunity for choices and keep that following of the impetus behind climate change activity. You may be familiar with the Rosebowl building, hopefully. When we built the building, we designed it from day one to make sure that it would be as environmentally friendly as possible with regards to carbon. So we looked for low carbon sources of supply for the building itself. We made sure that the choices we made regarding powering the building and using the building were low carbon as well. So you'll see things like grey water usage in the toilets, there's biomass boiler in the basement, we have recycling facilities, and there's climate control in the rooms, which is passive, and all the different materials we chose for the building as well were chosen to be low carbon in nature. Now that meant that we had to look really deeply into the supply chain when we were actually designing it, and I was part of the design team at the time who put the whole thing together. And this meant actually going and talking to suppliers and working out what the carbon impact was of every supply we chose for the building construction. As a final point then, in terms of how a company who was involved with construction or building might engage with the challenges of supply chain of climate change, I think it's worthwhile thinking about these issues really. First of all is specification, making sure that the things you're choosing to do and how you design the building and how you're making any choice in general is thought through carefully with respect to climate change issues. So whichever kind of company you're thinking about, you need to think about what you're designing, what the business model of that looks like, whether or not the thing you're actually making, the thing you're actually doing, can be done in a sustainable and low carbon fashion. Secondly is life cycle costing. Now this means that you are going to estimate the cost from not just purchasing something, but the purchase of it, the use of it, and then disposal of it in the end as well. So looking not just at that kind of initial cost, but the whole cost of ownership of an item. An example would be, let's say you make a decision to buy a car. You don't make a decision just upon the initial purchase price. You need to make a decision about the insurance, about the petrol you're going to put in the car. How, will it suit you for the next couple of years? Will you need to replace it? What the actual repair costs like? Same thing for buildings. When we're making choices regarding buildings, we need to think about whether or not the specification and the items we're purchasing for that building will actually be sufficient. Are we making adequate choices for long-term rather than making short-term choices? And that also factors into the equation the carbon load as well that the building will produce. Especially in public buildings in the UK, there's obviously going to be in the future more and more emphasis upon low carbon emissions from buildings. We've already seen many industries being wrapped up under what's called carbon trading schemes, whereby they have to purchase an offset for the carbon they emit. Same thing may start to come into place for lower and lower industries and wrapping up more and more of those areas of activity which might be impacted by the kind of businesses that you may be working for in a few years' time. This of course links to the cost in use, looking at the costs that are actually going to be incurred by running something. For example, looking back at my car analogy, if you're going to buy a car which is cheap but it uses lots and lots of fuel to run, it's maybe not the best choice. Same thing with a building. If you're going to buy a building or build a building that is very cheap to do initially, but it costs you a lot to run it long term, there's no real point in making that choice. And my background was in supply chain management, so therefore my role in kind of the construction process for the Rosebowl and in other buildings was looking at the supply chain, estimating what the carbon was likely to be from the supply chain, and seeing where we can optimise not only the cost but also the carbon emissions as well associated with the activity we're undertaking. So that's getting more and more prevalent, and more businesses are thinking about how they look into their supply chain and thinking whether or not they can actually optimise that somewhere. Finally then, reusing and repurposing things, particularly in construction. We don't just build a building and expect it to stay like that forever. We quite often build it and think, okay, over its lifespan of 30 years or so, we might want to change it. Let's make sure we can do that. So just as a reminder, on My Beckett, there are 2 articles on climate change and their impact on supply chains, which are a major element of the total carbon cost of the goods we use. And so therefore, supply chains need to be considered very carefully when we're discussing some of the impacts of climate change. How we move goods around the world has been severely impacted, where we get things from as well. Secondly, have a look at the COP29 website and have some look at some of the reports on there. Have a look at some of the newspaper reports. I would recommend The Guardian and the Financial Times and the Times' coverage. It's all very good. Also, look at some of the information in the IPCC 2024 report that I've linked on the module page. That's got lots of the raw data that if you want to write about this topic, you can draw upon that data to give some of the latest information or latest estimates about what the impact of climate change has been. Okay, thanks everyone. See you during the week.